The glass plate should have been empty. It was cracked at one corner, silvered with age, and wrapped in a laboratory cloth that had turned to dust. Yet when Helen Rusk lifted it toward the lantern, a field of stars emerged across its dark surface. Near the edge, beneath a paper label bearing a famous man's name, someone had carved 2 words directly into the glass. Beatrice Wynne. Helen had never heard the name. That frightened her more than the locked room where she found it. Only weeks earlier, Helen's research had appeared in a university announcement under another person's name. When she protested, she lost her job, her campus home, and nearly every reference she had earned. With nowhere else to go, she bought an abandoned observatory in the Arizona desert, a place the university claimed contained nothing worth saving. But the hidden plate suggested someone had lied. Then Helen found another, and another. Each one had been covered, renamed, or removed from the official record. Someone had gone to great effort to make sure the woman who created them disappeared. Outside, headlights appeared on the desert road. No visitor should have known Helen had opened the room. But what nobody knew was that the person coming for those plates was not afraid of the past alone. He was afraid of what Helen might prove next. Helen blew out the lantern and stood still until darkness swallowed the room. The headlights climbed the last bend of the desert road, vanished behind a ridge, then appeared again, larger and whiter against the windows. She wrapped the glass plate in its brittle cloth, slid it into an empty wooden case, and marked the case with a red line from the grease pencil in her pocket. She had learned not to trust memory when someone powerful wanted the record changed. A car door shut outside. Helen closed the hidden room, pushed the loose panel back beneath the telescope mount, and crossed the circular floor just as 3 hard knocks struck the main entrance. The man waiting outside wore a pale linen jacket unsuited to the blowing sand. Dr. Malcolm Vane had come without a tie, perhaps hoping informality would make his visit appear friendly. Beside him stood a narrow-faced attorney holding a leather folder. "Helen," Malcolm said, as though he had stopped by her old office. "We heard the sale finally closed." She kept one hand on the door. "Who is we?" "The university has an obligation to identify any scientific equipment transferred by mistake." The attorney opened his folder. Helen recognized the seal of the institution that had removed her building access before telling her she was dismissed. "The observatory and everything fixed to it were listed in the county sale," she said. "Buildings are one thing," Malcolm replied. "Research materials are another." His eyes moved past her toward the telescope. Weeks earlier, those same eyes had rested on the projection screen, while Helen explained the repeating dip in a distant star's light. She had shown him the sequence she isolated after 3 years of checking damaged scans and mislabeled files. Malcolm asked her to send the raw data so he could verify the calibration. 2 mornings later, the university announced his discovery. When Helen objected, he did not deny using her analysis. He questioned whether she had interpreted it correctly. By the end of the week, an old clerical error had become proof that she was unreliable. Her contract disappeared. Her campus apartment followed. References that once praised her precision stopped answering. Now Malcolm looked around the abandoned dome with the same patient concern he had used while dismantling her career. "You cannot safely remain here," he said. "The county report mentions unstable flooring, chemical residue, and failed ventilation. You came after dark to discuss ventilation?" The attorney shifted, but Malcolm smiled. "I came because I know how quickly you become absorbed in old data. There may be photographic materials stored in the structure. Glass negatives, observation plates." Helen kept her expression flat. "Where?" "This facility once had several storage areas." "What were they called?" For the first time, Malcolm hesitated. Then he glanced at the telescope base. "The North Plate Archive, among others." The phrase struck harder than a threat. No room by that name appeared on the deed, county inventory, or faded floor plan beside the entrance. Helen had discovered the chamber only because a corroded bolt turned when it should have been fixed. She stepped outside and pulled the door nearly closed behind her. "If the university believes it owns something here, send me a numbered inventory. That may take time." "I have time." The wind drove sand around their shoes. Malcolm looked down, and Helen saw fine gray dust caught along the welt of his polished boots. It was not the red powder covering the road. The same residue coated the stairs beneath the hidden archive. Someone had entered that room before she opened it. The attorney handed her a notice ordering her not to remove, sell, clean, photograph, or alter any scientific object until ownership could be reviewed. Malcolm lowered his voice. You have been through enough. No one expects you to restore this place. Let us recover what belongs to the university, and I can help you find somewhere suitable to live. It was almost the same offer he had made after taking her discovery. Accept a minor consulting credit, remain quiet, and perhaps he could preserve a future for her. Helen looked at the notice but did not sign it. What exactly are you trying to recover? Anything without a clear chain of custody. Such us? Unlabeled plates. The answer came too quickly. The plate bearing Beatrice Wynn's name had carried a newer label. The others in the room had also been covered or renamed. Malcolm was not searching for random antiques. He knew the collection had gaps. Helen drew the red grease pencil from her pocket and wrote the time across the bottom of the notice. Then she photographed the document before accepting it. Malcolm's smile thinned. You always did make records of everything. Only the things people might later claim never happened. A metallic scrape sounded inside the observatory. All three turned. The noise came from beneath the telescope platform, brief but heavy, like a wooden rack shifting across stone. The attorney stepped toward the door. Helen blocked him. You said the building was unsafe. Malcolm studied her face. If you find photographic materials, do not expose them to light. Some may be irreplaceable. His concern was too specific, his warning too late. Helen watched their car descend the road until its taillights disappeared. Then she locked the entrance, relit the lantern, and returned to the hidden archive. The red mark on the wooden case remained where she had left it. The wrapped plate was still inside. But the nearest storage rack had been dragged several inches from the wall. Behind it, scratched into the stone floor, a narrow trail of fresh gray dust led toward a second panel Helen had not seen before. At dawn, the second panel opened onto a narrow service shaft. Helen lowered the lantern through the gap before following. The shaft descended beneath the telescope platform and ended beside a brick-lined conduit packed with brittle cables. Most had been cut years ago. One remained intact, its black insulation newer than everything around it. It ran toward the eastern wall. Helen photographed the cable, dust trail, and panel screws. Then she resealed the opening. Whoever had shifted the storage rack might return, and she wanted the room to look undisturbed. By 8, the desert heat had settled over the dome. Helen carried 2 empty water jugs outside and found a county vehicle beside her truck. A building inspector stood near the dry storage tank. He handed her 3 notices without entering. The water system was unfit for habitation. The electrical service was unsafe. The dome presented a structural hazard. You inspected all of that this morning? Helen asked. The man avoided her eyes. The file was already open. She checked the number printed atop the first notice. The case had been created 4 days before the county auction transferred the property to her. Who requested the inspection? You can appeal through the office. Who opened the file? He tore a receipt from his pad. You have 72 hours to vacate, unless the conditions are corrected. His vehicle disappeared before Helen finished reading. She had enough bottled water for 3 days if she rationed it. The generator consumed more fuel than she could afford, and the nearest motel charged almost as much per week as she had paid for the observatory. She could sleep in her truck, but leaving the building unattended would give Malcolm the opening he wanted. An hour later, another car arrived. It belonged to a real estate agent named Franklin Moss. He wore a sun hat and carried a silver case. He said he represented an investment group interested in restoring historic desert properties. Helen placed the inspection notices on the steps. Your timing is remarkable. Franklin glanced at them as if expected. Old structures become expensive quickly. How expensive? He named a figure 8 times what Helen had paid. For a moment, she imagined clean water, a locked apartment, and enough money to hire an attorney before the university buried her under motions. She could leave that afternoon with more cash than she had possessed in years. Franklin opened the case. Inside lay a prepared purchase agreement. The buyer will cover relocation costs, he said. There may also be an opportunity for you to return to research work in a limited advisory role. Helen looked up. What investment group offers university positions? His mouth tightened. She turned the pages slowly. The agreement transferred the land, buildings, fixtures, instruments, archives, photographic materials, unpublished records, and all objects found on the property. Possession would pass immediately upon signing. Payment could be completed within 30 business days. They wanted everything before they paid her. A sentence near the bottom stopped her. All materials generated, stored, or discovered within the facility would become the buyer's exclusive property. Helen had seen almost the same language in the employment agreement Malcolm placed before her years earlier. She had believed it covered telescope time and university equipment. She had not understood how easily the phrase could be stretched until her analysis was announced without her name. She closed the contract. "You are not buying a building," she said. "You are buying anything I might find inside it." Franklin lowered his voice. "Dr. Vane believes this can end well for everyone. So Malcolm is the buyer." "I did not say that. You offered me research work." He packed the unsigned pages back into the case, but one sheet slipped onto the step. Helen saw a handwritten notation beside the asset list. Crate P17. Confirm before transfer. She had not yet opened crate P17. Franklin snatched up the page. "What is in that crate?" Helen asked. "An inventory reference. There is no inventory in the county file." He stood. "Think about where you will sleep 3 nights from now." Before leaving, he paused beside the notices. "Read the equipment transfer clause carefully," he said quietly. "Not every person carrying an offer believes you should accept it." Then he drove away. Helen returned inside and found crate P17 inches the archive's lowest row. She did not open it. Instead, she photographed every side, recorded the seal pattern, and drew a red line across the lid and wall so any movement would show. Only then did she study the inspection papers. The electrical notice referenced a service diagram attached to the original closure report. None had been included. Helen searched the entrance office until she found an old warning placard mounted crookedly beside the breaker cabinet. Behind it was a folded plan of the observatory's power system. Most circuits ended at the main generator. One line did not. It ran from beneath the telescope through the eastern conduit and continued beyond the building to a small structure marked auxiliary supply. Helen followed the line with her finger. If the diagram was accurate, someone had maintained a second source of electricity after the observatory closed. She switched off every breaker she could find. The building went silent. Then, beneath the floor, a mechanical counter clicked once. Helen placed her hand against the conduit. A faint vibration traveled through the cable toward the desert. The university had said the observatory had been electrically dead for nearly 60 years. Something outside was still feeding power into it. The cable left the eastern wall beneath broken vents and disappeared under hard-packed ground. When the afternoon heat began to fall, Helen followed it with the power diagram in her pocket. The line crossed open desert, then turned toward a low ridge behind the observatory. Beyond it stood a stone utility building, half hidden by mesquite. A thin column of vapor rose from the roof. Helen approached with her phone recording. The door opened before she touched it. An elderly man stepped outside carrying a wrench. A brass keyring hung from his belt. He looked past Helen toward the observatory, as if checking whether it still stood. "You shut the main breakers," he said. "You noticed." The clock stopped drawing against the auxiliary line. "What clock?" He went back inside. Helen followed. Water moved through a steel pipe, spun a compact turbine, and emptied into a covered channel. The machine was old but clean. Fresh lubricant shone around its bearings. A wall meter showed only a small current leaving the room. "Who are you?" Helen asked. "Amos Reed." She recognized the name from the closure documents. Amos had been the observatory's final maintenance supervisor and the man who certified the dome beyond repair. "You signed the shutdown report." "I signed several things. You also kept this running." "For what needed it?" "A county inspector says the building has no safe power or water. Meanwhile, you maintained a private supply on land I now own." Amos set the wrench on a bench. "That turbine predates the county service. It never belonged to the university. Why was it omitted from the sale inventory? Ask the people who prepared it." The diagram showed a second pipe entering from beneath the floor. Helen traced it to a pressure gauge. "Where does the water come from?" "A deep well north of the ridge. The observatory tank is dry." The line was capped. "By whom?" Amos looked at her. "People who wanted the place difficult to occupy." A mechanical click came from a gray cabinet. Inside, a rotating counter was connected to the outgoing cable. "What is it measuring?" "Humidity cycles." Helen thought of the archive beneath the telescope. "The current keeps the plates dry. It keeps one room dry." A strip of maintenance tape ran along the cabinet door. Dates had been written at 30-day intervals for years. the last less than a month old. Each entry carried only a small square instead of a signature. Helen photographed the strip. You serviced this continuously. I checked what would fail if nobody did. Then the observatory was never truly abandoned. Amos closed the cabinet. There is a difference between being abandoned and being left where powerful people hope no one will look. He knew exactly what the auxiliary line protected. Did Malcolm Vane send you? Amos gave a humorless laugh. Malcolm does not send me anywhere. You know him. I knew his father. Helen showed him a close photograph of the carved name without revealing the whole plate. Do you know Beatrice Wynne? Amos's gaze shifted to the image. Then the open door. You should not carry that around. That is not an answer. No, it is advice. Malcolm came the night I opened the archive. He knew what was inside. If you protected that room, tell me why. Amos picked up the wrench. You bought a building. Do not mistake that for buying every grievance attached to it. He moved to leave. Helen blocked him. You certified the dome could not be repaired. Yet the turbine works. The archive is preserved, and someone kept the mechanism from being removed. Either you helped conceal what happened here, or you kept it alive. His jaw tightened. If the dome were declared repairable, the university could have removed the telescope as usable equipment, he said. A ruined structure had to stay where it was. Helen remembered the report. Unable to rotate safely, not destroyed. Inaccessible, not worthless. What did you do? Nothing that cannot be undone. He walked toward the observatory, and Helen followed. Inside the dome, Amos pointed to a section of the circular track she had assumed was corroded. 2 bolts were missing. A guide wheel sat out of line. You removed it. I removed enough to stop a crane operator. He unlocked a wall cabinet. Gears and steel pins lay wrapped in oiled cloth. None appeared broken. Helen photographed them. Around the telescope base, shallow marks cut into the metal ring became visible beneath the dust. There were 100. Amos touched the first. She made one after every usable night during her final observing season. Beatrice, he looked away. The last is deeper because the tool slipped. What happened after the 100th night? A wooden knock sounded below them. Amos turned sharply. They opened the hidden room together. Nothing had fallen. Crate P-17 remained sealed, and Helen's red line was unbroken. Amos moved between the racks, counting under his breath. At the 5th, he stopped. One compartment is empty, Helen said. It has always been empty. You know that without an inventory? There was never an inventory you could trust. Helen checked her photographs. The empty slot matched the width of the others, but its wooden guides showed no wear. No glass had ever been placed there. The space had not been emptied. It had been built to receive something later. Amos reached for his keys. Gray dust coated one brass key, the same residue found on the archive stairs, and Malcolm's boots. You have been inside this room. I was waiting to see what you did with the first plate. Then tell me what belongs in that slot. Amos stared at the unworn guides. The plate Beatrice never placed here. Where is it? If I knew, Malcolm would not be searching for it. A faint scrape came from behind the empty compartment. Helen held the lantern close. A hairline seam outlined the back panel. Near the bottom, 3 short marks had been carved into the wood. They matched the marks on Beatrice's plate. The empty compartment was not a missing place in the archive. It was pointing to something behind it. Helen did not open the hidden panel immediately. She photographed the 3 marks, measured the seam, and placed a strip of paper across the edge with her signature and the time. If someone entered while she was away, the paper would tear. Amos watched without comment. You expected me to force it, she said. I expected you to decide whether curiosity mattered more than preserving what you already had. Those are not opposites. They become opposites when someone is waiting for you to damage the evidence. Helen left the panel sealed. Before she could learn what Beatrice had hidden, she needed water, power, and a telescope capable of producing a record no one could dismiss. The county had given her 72 hours. Malcolm was counting on the building defeating her before she understood it. Amos led her to a buried valve box between the dome and the old residence wing. The cover had been welded shut, but the weld was shallow and recent. Helen cut it with a handsaw, while Amos stabilized the frame. Below it, the pipe from the deep well remained connected. A steel cap had been fitted over the branch, leading to the observatory tank. It was not drained by age, Helen said. No. Someone deliberately isolated the building. Amos handed her a wrench. Now you know why I kept the turbine separate. The cap resisted until Helen braced both feet against the concrete rim. When it finally turned, trapped air hissed through the line. Minutes later, brown water struck the bottom of the tank. It cleared as the sediment passed, then ran cold and clean through a service tap. Helen filled one jug and carried a sample into the light. There was no odor, no oily film, and no clouding after it settled. It was not a home yet, but it could keep her alive. They spent the afternoon at the telescope. Under the dust, the main mirror was intact. Its reflective surface had dulled, but the glass showed no fracture when Helen moved a narrow beam across it. The mount leaned slightly east because one leveling screw had sunk into its base. The university report called the optical assembly irreparable, she said. The report was written from the doorway. By you. The conclusion they wanted was decided before I arrived. Helen did not excuse him. She also did not waste time arguing. Amos showed her where the original lifting frame had been stored. She built a temporary support, raised the mount a fraction of an inch, and reset the screw with a steel plate beneath it. By sunset, the telescope no longer pointed into the wall. The dome still could not rotate. Amos returned one guide wheel from the oiled cabinet, but kept the final pin in his pocket. You bought the building, he said. You have not proved you can operate it safely. Helen looked at the narrowing slit of evening sky above the fixed shutter. Then watch me prove it. She selected a bright star that would cross the opening without requiring a full rotation of the dome. She cleaned only the section of mirror needed for the observation, aligned the finder by hand, and mounted a small digital camera behind the original eyepiece assembly. The modern sensor would collect the image. A mechanical clock, disconnected from the university network, would establish the time. Helen placed a printed newspaper beside the clock and photographed both before beginning. Amos raised an eyebrow. Independent date, independent time, continuous recording, she said. No one gets to say I created the data later. Someone taught you to expect an argument. Someone taught me what happens when I do not. The star entered the narrow field shortly after 10. For 11 minutes, the telescope held it. The tracking mechanism shuddered twice but did not slip. Helen recorded the position, atmospheric conditions, exposure interval, and mechanical counter reading. Amos signed as witness only after checking every number himself. Then the image appeared on the camera screen, and it was imperfect. Dust scattered light around the star, and one corner showed a faint blur from the misaligned secondary mirror. But the point of light was unmistakable. The observatory had seen the sky again. Helen took the red grease pencil and marked a small line in her new logbook. Observation 1. A sharp smell reached her from the stairwell. Fuel. Amos moved first. They ran down to the main generator room, where diesel spread in a dark sheet beneath the reserve tank. The shutoff valve had been opened almost fully. Fuel dripped toward a junction box that sparked whenever the ventilation fan cycled. Helen killed the breaker. Amos closed the valve and packed absorbent cloth around the leak. Had the generator started automatically at dawn, the room might have burned before either of them reached it. The valve handle was clean, except for one fresh crescent of dark oil. Someone had opened it after Amos inspected the room that afternoon. Helen checked the outer door. It was locked. The old frame showed no damage. Who has a key? She asked. 3 keys were issued when the university closed the site. You have one. Amos nodded. Where are the others? One was returned to the facilities office. Conrad Vane kept the 3rd. Malcolm's father had been dead for 9 years. But keys outlived the people whose names were written beside them. Helen photographed the valve, the oil mark, and the fuel path. Then she sealed the room and carried the observation log upstairs. Her phone connected briefly to the weak cellular signal near the dome window. An email arrived from Malcolm. One night does not make the observatory yours. Helen read it twice. She had told no one about the observation. Amos had not left the property. The camera was not connected to the internet, and the mechanical clock could not transmit anything. She inspected the telescope mount, then the weather console. A tiny green light blinked behind a cracked plastic panel. The station computer appeared dead, but one narrow communications cable remained active. Its indicator flashed whenever the dome motor received power. Helen traced the cable into the wall and found a small transmitter stamped with a university asset number. Malcolm had not guessed that she completed an observation. The observatory had reported it to him. The transmitter's activity log contained only dates, times, and short bursts of coded numbers. Helen disconnected it, photographed every wire, and sealed the unit in a metal box. By noon, the university server stopped receiving updates from the dome. At 2, Franklin Moss called. "I am sending you a public auction listing," he said. "Do not ask how I found it." The link showed a private scientific collection scheduled for preview in Phoenix the next morning. Between antique microscopes and brass instruments was a single astronomical glass plate. The photograph was poor, but Helen recognized the narrow border, dark emulsion, and 3 short marks near one corner. The listing identified it as an early observation by Conrad Vane. The lot number was P17. Helen looked toward the sealed crate in the archive. Her red line remained unbroken. If the auction plate belonged to that designation, Malcolm's note did not refer to the crate itself. It referred to something expected inside it. Amos arrived before sunset carrying a replacement fuel valve. Helen showed him the listing. His face changed when he saw the plate. "You knew one was missing," she said. "I knew one never reached the archive. You also knew a collector." Amos set down his tools. Payment records from the auxiliary turbine included transfers from a preservation foundation. The foundation shared an address with the auction house. "You took their money," Helen said, "to keep the taxes paid. And what did you give them?" "Nothing from that room." "That is not the same as nothing." Amos looked toward the telescope. "If you go to Phoenix, do not let them separate the plate from its frame." "Why?" "The frame may tell you where it was stored." He refused to say more. The next morning, Helen drove 3 hours with copies of the deed, sale inventory, and photographs of the archive seals. Amos stayed behind to watch the observatory. The auction preview occupied a climate-controlled warehouse behind a row of galleries. A guard inspected Helen's identification twice before allowing her inside. The glass plate stood upright in a black display frame beneath amber light. Its paper label read C. Vane, 1967. A typed card described it as an unsuccessful exposure with no known scientific value. No known value. Yet 2 private bidders had registered offers above $10,000. Helen asked to examine the frame. The attendant refused. "Then rotate the display. Viewing position is fixed." She moved along the case until light struck the plate from the side. A section of the label had lifted. Beneath it, the glass carried a pale abrasion where someone had tried to grind away lettering. Near the bottom edge, wax filled 3 shallow cuts. The same 3 marks Beatrice had used on the hidden panel. A man in a charcoal suit entered through a private door and spoke quietly to the auction director. Helen recognized Malcolm before he turned. He did not appear surprised to see her. "You disconnected university equipment," he said. "You placed a transmitter inside my building. The station monitor predates your purchase. So does this plate." Malcolm glanced at the case. That object was loaned from the university's historical collection. Helen handed the director a copy of the county deed. The university did not list any plates in its retained property schedule. Malcolm produced another document. It described the observatory's plates as materials on indefinite institutional loan. The signature belonged to Conrad Vane. The date was 6 months after the observatory had closed. "Your father loaned the plates to a building the university no longer operated?" Helen asked. He formalized an existing arrangement. Without identifying a single plate, Malcolm raised his voice for nearby bidders to hear. "Miss Rusk was dismissed for mishandling research data. She is now claiming objects that do not belong to her. The familiar method was immediate. Make her defend herself instead of the evidence." Helen turned to the auction director. "Remove the plate from sale until ownership is reviewed. We require a court order. Then preserve the security footage and handling records." A young attendant approached and whispered that an advance buyer had requested immediate transfer. The offer was nearly triple the posted estimate. Helen saw Amos's Preservation Foundation named on the authorization form. For one sharp moment, every warning he had given her rearranged itself into betrayal. She called him. No answer. When she returned to the display case, the plate was gone. The director insisted it had been moved to secure storage. He refused to show her where. Helen demanded the camera records. The footage showed the attendant carrying the framed plate into a restricted corridor. 7 minutes later, another figure entered through the staff door wearing a hooded jacket and employee badge. The person emerged carrying a flat archival case. It was not Amos. It was Lena Ortiz. Lena had worked beside Helen for 2 years. She had watched Malcolm take Helen's discovery, then refused to support Helen's complaint because her doctoral review depended on his signature. Now the last person Helen expected to trust had walked out with the missing plate. Helen reached the parking lot in time to see Lena's car turn into traffic. Her phone rang. Amos's voice came through in a strained whisper. "Do not bring that plate back to the observatory. You knew Lena was here? Listen to me. Malcolm has someone waiting on the desert road. Where is she taking it? To the only place they cannot seize it before you know what is on it." The call ended. Across the street, Malcolm stepped into a black sedan. He was not following Lena. He was heading toward the highway back to the observatory. Helen reached the highway before Malcolm's sedan disappeared beyond the next ridge. Her phone rang again, this time from an unknown number. "Do not go back yet," Lena said. "Where are you?" "An old photo lab outside Tempe. Franklin arranged it. You took the plate. I stopped Malcolm's buyer from taking it." Helen gripped the steering wheel. "Amos says someone is waiting at the observatory. That is why you need to see this first." The address led to a shuttered newspaper building behind a tire shop. Franklin stood at a side entrance. He unlocked it without speaking and led Helen downstairs, where Lena had placed the archival case beneath a red safe light. The glass plate rested inside its original frame. "I know what you think of me," Lena said. "You watched Malcolm use my work and said nothing. I was 6 weeks from my doctoral review. That did not make me less alone." "No." Lena met her eyes. "It only made me a coward with a degree still held hostage." She opened a laptop. On the screen were folders copied from the university server, Helen's raw measurements, Malcolm's revisions, and archived scans bearing dates from the old observatory. "I kept a copy before he locked your account," Lena said. "He used files from this collection to fill gaps in your sequence." Helen looked from the screen to the plate. The image was faint, crossed by a hairline flaw. She mounted it on the lab scanner, recorded the frame number, and made a low-resolution test before adjusting the exposure. A field of stars emerged. Near the center, one point appeared slightly dimmer than the reference image. She measured it. Then she measured it again. The interval matched the repeating dip in the data Malcolm had announced as his discovery. "That is impossible," Lena whispered. "This was taken decades ago. It means the pattern was present then." Helen opened 3 archived scans from the university server. Each carried a modern catalog label and Conrad Vane's name. Their star positions continued the same cycle. Malcolm had not merely taken Helen's analysis. He had combined it with historical observations he never identified, using Beatrice's work as the missing baseline. Helen examined the frame Amos had warned her not to separate from the plate. Beneath one corner clamp was a folded strip of paper sealed with dark wax. It listed a date, weather conditions, exposure length, and the observer's initials. V. Conrad's name appeared only on the newer paper label fixed above it. Lena sat back. His father did the same thing. "No," Helen said. "They did not make the same mistake. They used the same system. Let women perform the long observation, calibration, and pattern work. Call them assistants. Remove their names from the material record. Then question their competence if they objected." Helen's complaint had not threatened one paper. It threatened a method that had protected the Vane family for nearly 60 years. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from Amos. The 4th came through as she reached for it. "They are at the observatory," he said. Wind battered his receiver. 2 university trucks and a county vehicle. "They have a temporary order to secure hazardous materials. Do not let them into the archive. I can delay them. I cannot stop an order." Helen photographed the plate, the hidden note, every clamp, and the wax seal. She made encrypted copies of the scans and sent them to 3 separate addresses. Franklin placed a document on the table. "There is another reason they are moving now." It was a scan of a handwritten ledger from the old observatory. A repeated phrase appeared beside selected dates. "Public trust threshold." "Where did you get this?" "From a retired county clerk." She remembered an instrument trust connected to the land. The phrase matched nothing in the sale records. Helen recalled the 100 marks around the telescope base. Beatrice had made them after usable nights, Amos said. A count that precise could have been more than a private ritual. They drove back after dark in separate cars. Malcolm's trucks were gone when they arrived. Amos stood beside the main entrance with a folded order in his hand. A fresh chain hung from the dome controls, and red inspection tags covered the telescope mount and main generator. The men had not entered the archive, but scrape marks around the lock showed they had tried before. Amos demanded that the order name the room specifically. It did not. They would return at sunrise with broader language and a locksmith. They asked for P-17, Amos said. Helen showed him the strip bearing Beatrice's initials. For several seconds, the old man said nothing. She kept records in the frames after Conrad began changing the logbooks, he said. I knew there was one outside the archive. I never knew who had it. Why did she mark 100 nights? Amos looked toward the telescope. Together they opened the hidden panel behind the unworn compartment. It did not contain another plate. A narrow steel tube lay inside, fixed to the back of the rotating base. Helen removed it only after photographing its position. The tube held a brittle legal document. The Observatory Instrument and Public Education Trust had been created before the university assumed control of the site. One clause stated that if a lawful steward completed and preserved 100 verifiable observing nights within a 12-month period, the property and fixed instruments could be dedicated permanently to public education. Once dedicated, they could not be sold for private development or removed for commercial use. Helen read the clause twice. The observatory was not only evidence, it was a path out of the institution that had buried the evidence. How many nights did Beatrice complete? Lena asked. 99, Amos said. The dome was closed before the final one. The deeper 100th mark had not recorded a completed observation. It pointed to the trust document hidden behind it. Helen's first logged night had restarted the count. Franklin knew a collector willing to purchase the P-17 plate immediately. The offer would cover legal representation, repairs, and living expenses for years. He did not pressure her, but he placed the written figure beside the unpaid fuel receipts and the county's vacancy order. The choice was no longer abstract. One signature could make the immediate threats disappear. But the plate leaves the sequence, Helen said. You would retain scans, Franklin replied. Scans can be challenged. A separated object becomes a private artifact with a disputed history. She looked at Beatrice's initials beneath the clamp. Selling the plate might save Helen. Keeping it with the collection could restore Beatrice, protect the observatory, and expose what the Vanes had done to other women. She closed the archival case. It stays. Lena connected her laptop to a local scanner so they could begin cataloging every plate before the inspection. She had copied the first directory when her university login vanished from the screen. A message replaced it. Access revoked. Materials under investigation. Seconds later, her phone rang. Her doctoral status had been suspended pending allegations that she stole confidential research. Malcolm had responded faster than Helen expected. Then the mechanical counter beneath the floor stopped clicking. Amos crossed to the humidity gauge. The needle was falling. Helen checked the archive door. Her seals were intact. No one had entered the room, but the auxiliary control line had been shut down from somewhere outside the building. Inside the racks, hundreds of glass plates began losing the one protection that had kept them alive for 6 decades. Helen moved before panic could take shape. She ordered Lena to photograph every gauge while Amos opened the archive's emergency cabinets. The shelves held desiccant tins, waxed paper, and wooden transport boxes designed for field expeditions. They worked plate by plate. Helen recorded each number and condition. Lena wrapped the frames. Amos filled the boxes with dry compound and closed the brass latches. The most fragile plates went into the residence wing, where thick adobe walls held a steadier temperature. By sunrise, they had protected 43. More than 200 remained. A county deputy arrived with 2 university security officers and a revised order. It now named the North Plate Archive, the telescope, the auxiliary turbine, and all associated documents. Malcolm had corrected every gap Amos used against him. No materials may be moved pending ownership review, the deputy said. If we leave them in failing humidity, they will deteriorate, Helen replied. The university has offered conservators, who report to Malcolm Vane. Amos stepped forward. The auxiliary supply was cut outside the property line. Restore it, and nothing needs moving. A security officer pointed at him. You admitted altering the dome mechanism and concealing equipment. I prevented theft. They arrested him for interference with secured property. As they led him away, Amos pressed a steel pin into Helen's palm. The manual track will take it, he said. Do not let them tell you old means useless. By noon, the university issued a statement. It described Helen as a former employee involved in a data integrity dispute. It claimed the observatory contained unstable chemicals, mishandled glass, and machinery modified by an unlicensed caretaker. Lena was named as a graduate researcher under investigation. The article did not mention Beatrice Wynne. That omission told Helen what Malcolm feared. Reporters called asking whether Helen had suffered a breakdown, whether she lived illegally in a condemned building, and whether Amos helped her steal university property. Malcolm did not need to prove she was wrong. He only needed to make people wonder whether she was rational enough to tell the truth. Helen refused live interviews. She released one written statement containing the deed, the early inspection date, photographs of the cut auxiliary line, and the ownership dispute notice. She withheld the plate images. "You are giving them less than they expect," Lena said. "I am giving them only what can already be proved." Without Amos, every task took longer. Helen documented the temporary cabinet as carefully as any laboratory instrument: serial numbers, temperature readings, seal times, and witnesses. If Malcolm later accused her of mishandling the archive, he would have to argue against a record created minute by minute. Helen built a temporary drying cabinet from a metal locker, a heater, and a battery-powered fan. Lena created duplicate catalogs on 3 disconnected drives. At dusk, the main generator stopped. The fuel line was intact and the battery charged. A control relay had been removed from the locked panel. Helen checked the roof vents and found one grill hanging by a screw. Beyond it, a narrow shaft descended into the maintenance corridor. They ran to the archive. The seals remained unbroken. The boxes were untouched, but a plate on the upper rack carried a fresh crack along its edge. The fracture began beside a circular pressure mark, as if a metal rod had been lowered through the vent and pressed against the glass. "They could not steal it," Lena said. "So they tried to ruin it." The damaged plate bore no famous name. Its label listed Beatrice only as technician. That made it more important, not less. Helen patted the frame and photographed the mark. A rectangular vent sat directly above the shelf. They followed the shaft to an old maintenance office on the west side of the dome. A new padlock secured its outer door. Inside, fresh footprints crossed decades of dust. The missing relay lay on a desk beside a telescoping inspection rod. Its rubber tip matched the mark on the plate. Lena raised her phone. "We have them. We have a university tool in a university room," Helen said. "Malcolm will call it safety work." Beneath blank inspection forms, Helen found a work order authorizing entry that morning. The technician's signature was empty. Malcolm was listed as the requesting administrator. It was evidence, but not enough to stop what followed. The county canceled the observatory's temporary insurance because of unauthorized equipment operation. Public access was prohibited. The university petitioned for emergency possession of the plates. Then the collector who wanted P17 doubled the offer. Helen deleted it. That night, she and Lena prepared another observation without the generator. They carried a marine battery to the dome, used hand lamps, and set the mechanical clock beside the telescope. The motorized tracker could not run. Helen fitted Amos's steel pin into the manual gear and turned the wheel herself, advancing the telescope in measured intervals. The process was slow and impossible to hide behind software. It was also impossible to alter from a university server. For 40 minutes, Helen tracked the star by hand while Lena called the time marks. Every adjustment was written on paper and filmed by 2 cameras. The record was crude, but the coordinates remained within tolerance. Night 2 was valid. By dawn, messages had reached them. A retired researcher wrote that Malcolm removed her name from a calibration paper 12 years earlier. Another said Conrad Vane called Beatrice the girl who loaded plates, though she alone calculated long exposure corrections. A third agreed to speak, then withdrew after the university contacted her about her pension. Helen printed every message, including the withdrawal. The pattern extended beyond her and Beatrice. A courier arrived with a settlement from the university. Malcolm would withdraw the possession request, restore Lena's academic status, and fund conservation of the plates. In return, Helen would transfer the archive, end the 100-night effort, and agree that attribution questions required private review. It was the first offer that promised to save everyone without asking Helen to admit she was wrong. It was also the cleanest trap he had set. Before she finished reading, tapping came from inside the archive. Metal touched metal at regular intervals. Helen and Lena entered with their cameras running. The sound came from the shaft above the cracked plate. A thin rod lowered through the grill, searching for the next frame. Helen reached the vent shaft before the rod touched another plate. She seized it with both hands and pulled. For a second, someone above resisted. Then the rod slipped free and clattered across the archive floor. Lena kept filming while Helen ran to the maintenance office. The outer door stood open. Beyond it, a university service truck was already crossing the lower road. The rod carried a removable rubber tip and a scratched equipment number. Helen photographed both, sealed the tool in a shipping tube, and sent copies of the video to the county attorney, 2 reporters, and an independent preservation society. By afternoon, the university stopped calling the damage routine maintenance. It called it an unauthorized act by an unidentified contractor. Amos was released shortly before sunset. The charge against him remained, but the footage made it difficult to justify holding him while the person who entered the maintenance office went unnamed. He returned tired. Dust settled into the lines around his eyes. Helen placed the recovered rod on the table. "Did Conrad use that shaft?" she asked. "Not that tool. The shaft, yes." Amos sat beneath the dark dome and finally gave her the part of the story he had withheld. He had been 16 when Beatrice Wynne taught him how to clean a guide track without shifting the telescope's alignment. Official records described her as a photographic technician. In practice, she selected targets, calculated exposure times, corrected for temperature, and spent entire nights at the eyepiece while Conrad Vane arrived near dawn to collect the logs. She knew he was changing the labels, Amos said. At first, she thought careful records would protect her. What changed? Conrad learned he could rewrite the records, too. Beatrice began hiding observation notes inside plate frames. She made duplicate calculations and marked the rotating base after each valid night. When the trust clause came to light, Conrad closed the observatory before she could complete the 100th observation. "Why did you sign the closure papers?" "Because they gave me one choice. Certify the dome as unusable, or watch them dismantle it and carry every plate to the university." Amos had chosen the lie that kept the evidence in one place. Helen understood the cost without forgiving it. His silence had protected the building, but it had also allowed Beatrice's name to disappear. "You could have spoken later. I told myself keeping the telescope here was enough." He looked toward the archive. "It was easier to guard a machine than admit I had watched them erase a person." He removed the lining from an old wooden eyepiece box. Beneath it lay a folded page bearing the same trust title as the document hidden behind the archive rack. The page contained the dedication procedure, a licensed observer, 2 independent witnesses, and a public record of all 100 nights were required. It also named the county clerk, who had notarized the original trust, but the date beside her seal had been cut away. Without that date, Malcolm could argue that the page had been added after the university assumed control. Lena searched newspaper archives, while Helen contacted former researchers. 7 women had left Malcolm's department after disputes over credit. 4 refused to speak. 2 sent written summaries without names. The 7th, Dr. Evelyn Shaw, agreed to a recorded statement. She described a calibration method she developed 12 years earlier. Malcolm published it under the name of a male colleague, then threatened her pension when she challenged him. Her testimony gave the pattern a living witness. An hour before the recording, Evelyn called back. "I cannot do it," she said. "The university reminded me that my medical coverage is tied to my retirement agreement." Helen did not pressure her. "May I preserve the fact that you contacted us?" Silence followed. "Yes," Evelyn whispered, "but not what I told you." The call ended, leaving Helen with another absence shaped exactly like fear. Lena found something more useful in a 1968 newspaper scan. An article praising Conrad's discovery quoted a phrase about the patient dimming between intervals. The wording appeared nowhere in his published paper. It appeared word for word in Beatrice's handwritten note inside the P-17 frame. Conrad had copied not only her data but her language. The article also named a photographer present during the observatory's closure ceremony. Amos remembered that she took pictures of the trust papers spread across a table before officials packed them away. Her estate had donated its negatives to a regional historical archive. Helen called the archive director. The woman confirmed that an uncatalogued box from the observatory ceremony remained in storage. She agreed to hold it for review the following morning. Then Lena checked the university's public disposal schedule. The same archive building was being cleared at 9. The official reason was mold remediation. All uncatalogued material from former university facilities had been authorized for destruction. Malcolm had issued the order 3 days before Helen found the trust document. Amos rose and reached for his keys. The archive is 2 hours away. Helen copied the disposal notice, the box number, and the director's confirmation. She sent them to the county clerk and requested an emergency preservation hold. No reply came. At 6:14 the next morning, the archive director called. "University trucks are already here," she said. They moved the destruction forward. Behind her voice, Helen heard cardboard being dragged across concrete. The box containing the only photograph that could validate the trust date was already on its way to the loading bay. Helen reached the regional archive as the first cart rolled toward the loading bay. A university contractor was stacking uncatalogued boxes beside a shredding truck. The archive director stood between 2 workers and a gray carton marked Observatory Closure, 1968. "That box is under preservation request," Helen called. "No signed hold has been received," the contractor replied. Lena raised her camera. Amos photographed the truck number. Helen displayed. "The direct has written, Malcolm, to Hever, to the T, to the torn documents, and the disposal order Malcolm had approved before anyone publicly knew the trust existed." The contractor reached for the carton. The archive director pulled it behind her. "If you destroy it after seeing those documents," she said, "you will be destroying disputed evidence on camera." The workers stopped. 20 minutes later, the county attorney issued a temporary hold. Inside the carton, they found contact sheets from the observatory's closure ceremony. One image showed the trust pages spread across a table. The missing date was visible beside the notary's seal. Another showed Beatrice standing behind the telescope while Conrad Vane signed an equipment receipt in the foreground. The photograph did not prove everything. It proved the trust existed before the university took control, and that Conrad had seen Beatrice working as an observer. On the back of the contact sheet, the photographer had written the names of everyone present. Beatrice was identified as chief night observer. Conrad was listed as university liaison. Malcolm's lawyers immediately challenged the handwriting, but the archive director produced 2 other contact sheets marked by the same photographer. The lettering matched. That was enough to keep the fight alive. Over the following months, Helen continued the count. Some nights lasted hours. Others produced only the minimum verified exposure before clouds crossed the desert. Each record carried the mechanical clock, 2 witnesses, weather notes, raw images, and a public copy filed with the county. Former teachers, amateur astronomers, retired engineers, and women who had left Malcolm's department took turns witnessing. Night 31 survived a failed battery. Night 52 continued after a sandstorm stripped canvas from the residence roof. On night 74, Dr. Evelyn Shaw appeared without warning and signed her name beneath the observation log. She did not give the statement Malcolm had frightened her away from making. She simply remained beside Helen until the exposure ended. By night 99, the observatory was no longer an isolated ruin. People arrived with water, tools, legal copies, and cameras. A local school placed copies of the public logs in its library. 3 former researchers added sworn statements to the county file. Malcolm could still attack Helen, but he could no longer make her disappear quietly. The 100th night drew the county board, 2 independent astronomers, reporters, university attorneys, former researchers, and residents who had followed every public log. Malcolm arrived carrying 3 document cases. The hearing began beneath the dome before sunset. His attorneys argued that the trust had never been properly activated. They claimed the plates belonged to the university, Beatrice had served only as a technician, and Helen's recent observations were an attempt to manufacture control of disputed property. Then, Malcolm presented the first final obstacle. A conservation expert testified that several paper labels had been removed and reapplied. Because the labels were altered, she could not certify who created the plates. Malcolm looked toward the press. The entire claim depends on names that may have been added later. Helen did not defend the labels. She placed P17 beneath a sidelight and showed the name cut into the glass below the paper. She presented the hidden note sealed inside its original frame, the period-correct emulsion, the manufacturer's marks, and the star field matching the sky on the recorded date. Another plate carried positioning scratches that aligned with Beatrice's mechanical log. A third contained the same flaw visible in the 1968 contact sheet. Paper can be replaced, Helen said. The glass, the emulsion, and the sky cannot. The independent astronomers agreed that the observations formed a coherent sequence. The expert conceded that the physical marks predated the newer labels. Malcolm shifted to Helen's own research. He called her analysis unstable and claimed the similarity between old and modern data resulted from selective comparison. Lena opened the server audit copied before her account was revoked. It showed Malcolm importing scans from the historical archive into his project 11 days before announcing Helen's discovery. He had used Beatrice's baseline and Helen's analysis while crediting neither woman. The room changed. Reporters stopped watching Helen and began watching him. Outside, the wind struck the dome. A wall of dust moved across the western desert faster than the forecast predicted. The county chair warned that the final observation had to be completed before conditions made the telescope unusable. Helen climbed to the controls. The electric rotation motor started, groaned, and stopped. Sand had packed into the exposed track. When she engaged the manual system, the dome moved less than an inch before the emergency chain snapped tight. A university lock had been added to the outer gear housing under the temporary possession order. Malcolm's attorney raised the order. No one may alter secured equipment. Without the dome opening, there would be no 100th observation. The county chair checked the trust clause. The record must be created tonight. Prior intent is not completion. This was the second final obstacle. Amos reached for a ladder, but wind shook the upper platform. Helen stopped him. Beatrice had designed a secondary crank for nights when the main gear froze. Amos had shown Helen the manual track, but Helen had operated it through the interior wheel. The older crank connected from beneath the floor. She removed the lower service plate, fitted Amos's steel pin into the hidden coupling, and turned. Nothing moved. She repositioned the pin into the deeper notch marked by the 100th line. The coupling caught. Lena and 2 county workers braced the crank while Helen called each turn. Above them, the dome opened against the storm in slow, grinding increments. Malcolm stepped forward. "This is reckless. She is not a trained observer." Helen faced him with both hands still on the crank. "You called Beatrice a technician because she made your father's observations possible. You called me a data handler because I made yours possible. The work only becomes science after you put your name on it." She returned to the telescope. The target star appeared through a narrowing band of clear sky. Helen aligned the instrument, started the mechanical clock, and exposed the plate while the 2 independent astronomers verified the coordinates. Halfway through, Malcolm saw Lena remove the final glass plate from its case. His composure broke. That plate should have been destroyed in 1967. Silence spread beneath the dome. No public inventory mentioned the plate. Malcolm had denied knowing it existed. Lena turned it toward the sidelight. Beatrice's name was carved into the edge. Beside it, in different handwriting, Conrad Vane had written, "Observation completed by B. Wynne. Results confirmed." The exposure timer rang. Helen closed the shutter and entered the final reading into the log. Both astronomers signed. The county chair added the 100th record to the public file. The trust condition was complete, but completion did not guarantee victory. As the storm darkened the dome, the county board withdrew to decide whether the evidence was sufficient to remove the observatory from university control or whether Malcolm's legal claim would bury both women's names again. The county board returned after 43 minutes. Dust pressed against the dome windows, turning the remaining daylight the color of old copper. No one spoke when the chair took her seat. "The trust was valid before university control began," she said. "The 100-night condition has been completed under public record. Effective immediately, the observatory and its fixed instruments are protected for public educational use." Helen did not move. She had imagined victory as relief. Instead, she felt the weight of everything that still required repair. The university's emergency possession order was suspended. Its security officers were instructed to remove the chain from the dome controls and surrender all keys. The county placed the plate collection under independent conservation, but the plates would remain at the observatory unless moving one became necessary for preservation. Malcolm's attorney stood. "The university will appeal." "You may," the chair replied. "The trust property cannot be transferred or dismantled during that appeal." The second ruling concerned attribution. The two astronomers submitted a joint finding that Beatrice Wynne had conducted the historical observations credited to Conrad Vane. They also confirmed that Helen's analysis identified the modern repeating pattern and that Malcolm's publication relied on both women's work without disclosing either source. The Scientific Society agreed to reopen the historical record. Helen's university announcement would be corrected pending a wider review of the department's research practices. It was not a complete restoration. Journals would need amended citations. Grants would be examined. Other women would have to decide whether they could endure telling their stories publicly. But Malcolm no longer controlled the first official version of the truth. Reporters surrounded him near the door. He did not collapse, confess, or ask forgiveness. He repeated that he had acted for the university and that complex research often involved shared contributions. Then a reporter asked why he knew the final plate was supposed to have been destroyed. Malcolm stopped answering. That silence followed him out of the dome. Amos's interference charge was dismissed before midnight. The university's maintenance contractor was identified from the service truck records, and the county opened a separate investigation into the damaged plate, the severed auxiliary power line, and the altered disposal schedule. The cracked plate could not be restored to its original condition. A conservator stabilized the fracture and preserved the pressure mark left by the rod as evidence. Helen insisted the damage remain documented beside the plate rather than hidden in a repair report. The scar was now part of the record of what someone had tried to erase. Lena's doctoral suspension was lifted. She was offered immediate reinstatement under a new advisor. Helen received a different offer. The university president proposed a permanent research post, back pay, and a public statement praising her persistence. The letter described the institution as eager to welcome her home. Helen read it beside the telescope that the same institution had declared worthless. "This place is home," she said. She did not reject research. She rejected returning under conditions that allowed the powerful to decide when her name had value. The observatory still had a leaking residence roof, an unreliable generator, and more damaged plates than the emergency boxes could safely hold. The trust protected the property, but it did not magically provide money. The community formed a restoration committee. The school donated shelving. Franklin arranged pro bono legal help without asking for any ownership. Evelyn Shaw gave her recorded statement once her medical coverage was secured through an independent plan. Two other former researchers added theirs. Helen also created a rule before the first new research project began. Every observation log would list the person at the telescope, the person who processed the image, and the person who interpreted the data. No contribution could disappear behind the word assistant. The first corrected scientific notice appeared 3 weeks later. It named Beatrice Wynne as the original observer. It named Helen Rusk as the analyst who connected the historical and modern records. Conrad and Malcolm Vane remained in the history, but not as the only names that mattered. On the morning the temporary chains were removed, Helen installed the restored guide wheel herself. Amos handed her the final pin, then stepped back. She turned the mechanism. The dome moved smoothly across the desert sky. At the first public meeting, the county chair asked Helen to submit an official name for the new educational trust. Everyone expected her to choose Helen Rusk Observatory. She looked toward the archive, where P17 rested again among the plates that gave it meaning. Then, she wrote another woman's name on the form. The new sign arrived on a cold morning 6 months later. Beatrice Wynne. Public Observatory. The letters were plain black metal, mounted above the stone entrance Amos had repaired by hand. Beneath them, in smaller type, the county added, Helen Rusk, Founding Scientific Director. Helen had objected to the second line at first. Amos had not. "You are not honoring Beatrice by disappearing beside her," he said, so both names remained. The university's appeal was still moving through court, but the trust protections held. Donations paid for a new archive cooling system, not a grand lobby. The residence roof stopped leaking. The old generator was rebuilt, and the auxiliary turbine continued turning beneath the ridge. Nothing in the observatory looked polished enough to hide its history. The cracked plate remained in a stabilized frame, with the pressure mark from the metal rod visible along its edge. A note beside it explained that preservation did not mean pretending damage had never happened. P17 rested between the plates that came before and after it. Its paper label, Conrad Vane's writing, Beatrice's carved name, and the note hidden within the frame appeared together in the digital record. No layer was removed to make the story simpler. Helen applied the same principle to every future project. Each observation entry listed the person who operated the telescope, processed the image, checked the measurements, and formed the interpretation. Students could see exactly how knowledge was built and whose hands had built it. Lena returned to complete her doctorate, but not in Malcolm's department. She based her dissertation at the Observatory and placed her own name first on the work she led. Evelyn Shaw joined the independent panel examining disputed research. 2 other women eventually testified after receiving legal protection. Amos became the observatory's mechanical conservator. He worked from the stone utility building beside the turbine. Above his bench, he hung the closure report he had signed decades earlier. Across it, he wrote, "I protected the machine before I learned to protect the person." He never asked anyone to excuse his silence. He taught every volunteer that silence could preserve evidence and still abandon the human being whose evidence it was. On opening night, cars lined the desert road where Helen had once watched Malcolm's headlights approach. There were no private donors' tables or reserved seats for university officials. Folding chairs filled the courtyard. Retired teachers sat beside amateur astronomers, ranch workers, former researchers, and women who had never entered a scientific building. Inside the dome, Helen stood beside a map of the night sky. The red grease pencil remained in her pocket. She told the visitors that Beatrice had observed from this room when women were often recorded as technicians, assistants, or unnamed labor. She did not describe Beatrice as helpless. She described her calculations, patience, methods, and the choices she made when the records began changing around her. Then Helen opened the dome. One by one, visitors climbed the platform and looked through the restored telescope. Each person was shown how the tracking wheel moved, how time was recorded, and where the observer's name belonged in the log. Near midnight, a woman with silver hair remained at the end of the line. She said she had worked in a school office for 32 years and had always wanted to study astronomy. "I suppose I waited too long," she said. Helen adjusted the eyepiece. "The sky has never asked anyone's age." The woman looked through the telescope and became completely still. After the last car descended the road, Helen and Lena carried the evening log to the archive. Amos shut down the public lights, but left the dome motor active. Helen entered the names of every observer who had used the telescope that night. At the bottom of the page, she marked the target star with her red pencil. Years earlier, Malcolm had erased her red marks from a presentation because they revealed the pattern he wanted to claim. This time, the line remained. Helen opened the P-17 cabinet. The final plate occupied the space Amos had kept empty for nearly 60 years. Its archival card carried 2 entries. Beatrice Wynne, original observer. Helen Rusk, restored attribution and analysis. There was room beneath them for those who would study the record next. Helen returned to the dome. The telescope pointed toward the same star Beatrice had followed across the desert sky. Its light had traveled for years without knowing which human name would be attached to it. The sky had preserved the event without favor, even while people changed labels, altered records, and decided whose work deserved remembrance. Helen turned the dome until the opening framed the star. The world had once treated the observatory as dead land, and Helen as disposable labor. Yet the abandoned place had given her more than proof. It had given her a way to build a record no one person could secretly own. The sky had never forgotten either woman. Only people had, and now, beneath the turning dome, both names remained where no one could cover them again.